Karen laughs at Muslim man in line, then discovers he's her new boss. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Samantha adjusted the strap of her bag as she stepped into the brightly lit cafeteria of Henderson and Company, the corporate headquarters of one of the country's leading business firms. The lunch hour rush was in full swing, with employees chatting in line, the hum of conversations blending with the clatter of trays and cutlery. She took her place near the back of the line, waiting patiently, when a loud sigh erupted from behind her. "Oh, for the love of, this is taking forever." Samantha turned slightly, noticing the woman standing a few feet behind her. Karen Monroe. A mid-level employee in the finance department, Karen had a reputation. Entitled, loud, impatient. Someone who always found a way to make herself the center of attention. Karen sighed again, this time dramatically rolling her eyes, making sure everyone around her saw just how inconvenienced she was. Some people take forever to order, like they don't know how menus work. Samantha ignored her, stepping forward as the line moved. That's when Karen shifted her attention to the man standing in front of Samantha. He was dressed in a simple but well-fitted suit, his beard neatly groomed, his presence quiet but assured. He didn't seem bothered by the wait, scrolling through his phone as he held a tray in one hand. Karen, however, scoffed under her breath. "Unbelievable," she muttered to her co-worker Tina, who stood beside her. Tina frowned. "What?" Karen smirked, nodding toward the man. "I just think it's funny, that's all. You know how some people act like they belong in places like this?" Tina's eyes widened slightly. "Karen?" Karen just chuckled, shaking her head. "I mean, really? The suit doesn't fool anyone." Samantha's jaw tightened. She knew exactly what Karen was implying. The man in front of them, Omar Hassan, had darker skin, a neatly wrapped keffiyeh, and a quiet dignity that Karen was clearly uncomfortable with. Omar didn't turn, didn't acknowledge Karen's words. But Samantha saw the way his shoulders straightened slightly, as if bracing himself. Karen, apparently emboldened by the lack of reaction, leaned closer to Tina and whispered just loud enough to be heard. "I bet he got hired because of some diversity quota. Or maybe he's just visiting. Someone's cousin who got lucky." Tina looked mortified, but Karen just laughed. Samantha gritted her teeth. She wanted to say something, but before she could, something unexpected happened. A manager appeared near the registers, scanning the cafeteria as if looking for someone. The second she spotted Omar, she hurried over with a nervous but eager expression. Karen smirked. "Oh great, looks like someone's in trouble." Samantha knew she was wrong. The manager stopped right in front of Omar, smiling brightly. "Mr. Hassan, we've been expecting you." Karen's smirk faltered. Omar looked up from his phone and nodded politely. "Thank you. I was just grabbing a quick lunch." The manager gestured toward the executive dining section, a private area reserved for senior-level staff. "If you'd like, we have a table ready for you in the executive lounge." Karen's eyes widened slightly. "Wait, what?" Tina, who had been awkwardly shifting in place, suddenly looked as if she had just realized something. Omar gave a small, polite smile. "That's not necessary, but I appreciate it." The manager nodded, still looking flustered. "Of course, sir. Let me know if you need anything." Omar thanked her before turning back toward the register. Karen was frozen in place, staring after the manager. What was that about? Samantha watched the realization slowly dawn on her. The man she had just mocked, insulted, and dismissed as someone who didn't belong, was someone important. She just didn't know how important. As Omar paid for his food, he turned slightly, and for the first time locked eyes with Karen. His expression was unreadable, but the moment stretched between them. Karen quickly looked away, flustered, shifting uncomfortably. Samantha smirked slightly. She had a feeling Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Later that afternoon, Samantha sat at her desk, waiting for the inevitable gossip to spread. And as expected, it did. By the time the lunch break ended, everyone was talking about the new high-profile executive. Karen was still shaken when she got back to her department, her usual confidence cracked. "I don't get it," she muttered to Tina as they walked toward their desks. "Who the hell is that guy?" Tina glanced around, lowering her voice. "Are you serious? You don't know?" Karen shook her head, crossing her arms. "Why would I?" Tina sighed, pulling out her phone. "His name is Omar Hassan. And as of today, he's our new vice president of operations." Karen froze. The words didn't register at first. Tina continued, swiping through the article. "He was appointed last month, but today was his official first day. He's been working with upper management for weeks. Apparently, he's some big deal in corporate strategy. Used to work with Fortune 500 companies and now he's here. Karen felt like the air had been knocked out of her. She had laughed at, insulted, and belittled her new boss. Samantha, sitting a few desks away, caught the look on Karen's face. She could practically see the panic settling in. Karen shook her head, whispering furiously, "There's no way. I mean, he doesn't even look like a corporate executive." Tina's face went blank. "Karen." Karen swallowed hard, realizing how bad that sounded. Before she could backtrack, a voice interrupted them. "Excuse me." Karen turned, and there stood Omar Hassan, watching her with calm, unreadable eyes. Her stomach dropped. "I believe we haven't been properly introduced," Omar said smoothly. "You must be Karen Monroe." Karen's face turned bright red. Samantha couldn't help but grin. Oh, this was going to be good. Karen's stomach twisted into knots as she stared up at Omar, his calm, unreadable expression making it impossible to gauge what he was thinking. Around her, the office had gone dead silent. Everyone had stopped what they were doing, their eyes bouncing between her and their new boss. She forced a stiff smile, trying to regain her composure. "Oh yes, Mr. Hassan, of course." She extended her hand, her palm slightly clammy. "It's a pleasure to meet you." Omar didn't take her hand right away. Instead, he let the moment stretch just long enough for Karen to feel the full weight of what was happening. Then finally he reached out and shook her hand, firm but brief. "I understand you work in the finance department," he said, his voice calm yet authoritative. Karen nodded quickly, laughing nervously. "That's right. Been here for a few years now." Omar glanced around at the quiet office. He could feel the tension in the room. People were pretending to work, but everyone was listening. He knew exactly what had happened earlier. "I see," he said simply. Then, after a pause, he added, "I believe we've crossed paths before, haven't we?" Karen's heart skipped a beat. She knew he knew, but she couldn't admit it. "Oh? I don't think so," she lied, forcing another laugh. "But you know, it's a big company. Lots of faces." Omar's lips curled into the smallest hint of a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Indeed," he said. Then, with an air of finality, he added, "Well, I look forward to working with you, Ms. Monroe." With that, he turned and walked toward his office, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Karen barely exhaled, forcing herself to act normal as she turned back toward her desk. But the whispers were already starting. Tina leaned closer, murmuring under her breath, "Oh, my God. He knows, Karen. He knows." Karen swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." Tina scoffed. "Are you serious? We all heard what you said in the cafeteria. And now, he's your boss. This is bad." Karen clenched her jaw, trying to ignore the panic rising in her chest. She refused to believe that one small incident at lunch could actually affect her job. "He's got bigger things to worry about," she muttered. "He's not going to waste time thinking about some stupid comment." Tina gave her a look. "You really think that?" Karen wanted to believe it, but deep down she wasn't sure. The next few days were filled with an unsettling tension. Karen went out of her way to avoid Omar at all costs. She took different routes around the office to avoid passing his office door. She waited for the cafeteria rush to die down before grabbing lunch. She even skipped certain meetings where she knew he would be present, feigning busyness or sending a colleague in her place. But it didn't matter. She felt his presence everywhere. And then, on Friday morning, her worst fear came true. She was sitting at her desk when she received an email notification. Subject: Meeting request, Omar Hassan. Time: 2 p.m. Location: Executive Office. Karen's stomach flipped. She stared at the email as if willing it to disappear. This was it. She was getting fired. Tina peeked over at her screen, her eyes widening. "Oh, wow." Karen turned sharply toward her. "What?" Tina pointed at the email. "You're meeting with him? Alone?" Karen forced a nervous laugh. "It's probably just, I don't know, a check-in or something." Tina didn't look convinced. "Well," she said, standing up, "good luck with that." Karen gulped. She had a feeling she was going to need it. By the time 2 p.m. arrived, Karen's palms were sweaty. She stood outside Omar's office door, trying to steady her breathing. Finally she knocked. "Come in," his voice called. Karen pushed the door open and stepped inside. Omar's office was sleek and modern, with a large window overlooking the city. He sat behind his desk, his posture calm, unreadable. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Have a seat." Karen sat, forcing a polite smile. "Thank you, Mr. Hassan." For a moment he simply studied her. Then he spoke. Karen, he began, his tone measured, I believe we need to have an honest conversation. Karen's stomach dropped. Oh no, here it comes. Omar leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. You've been with this company for a while now. From what I understand, you've had a steady career here. Karen nodded quickly, eager to shift the conversation. Yes, that's right. I've been in finance for a few years, and I've always been a dedicated employee. Omar nodded. That's good to hear. Then, after a brief pause, he continued, because I've also heard other things. Karen froze. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Omar's gaze was steady, giving her no escape. I make it a point to understand the culture of the company I'm leading, he said. And that includes knowing how employees treat one another. Karen's throat went dry. Mr. Hassan, He raised a hand, silencing her. Karen, he said, his voice still calm but firm, I don't care about personal grudges. But what I do care about is the kind of workplace we cultivate. And right now, I'm questioning whether you align with the kind of leadership we need here. Karen swallowed hard. I understand. Omar didn't look convinced. Do you? Karen hesitated. Yes, absolutely. I believe in respect, inclusivity. Omar's eyebrow lifted slightly, as if challenging her to continue. She felt herself breaking under the weight of it. He leaned back in his chair. Karen, I'm giving you an opportunity here. An opportunity to reevaluate the way you interact with your colleagues, the way you represent this company. Because let me be clear, what happened in the cafeteria did not go unnoticed. Karen's face burned with shame. There it was. He had heard everything. Omar let the silence stretch before continuing. You have a choice, he said finally. You can either acknowledge your mistakes and change, or... He let the words linger. Karen knew what he meant. If she didn't change, she wouldn't last here. I understand, she said quickly. I really do. I want to be better. Omar studied her for a long moment. Then finally he nodded. Good, he said simply. Then prove it. Karen nodded furiously, standing so quickly she almost knocked over the chair. Thank you, Mr. Hassan. I appreciate this. As she practically ran out of his office, she knew one thing for sure. Her life at this company had just changed forever. Karen left Omar's office feeling like she had just walked through a storm. Her hands trembled slightly as she closed the door behind her. She wasn't fired. Not yet. But the warning was clear, she was being watched. As she walked back toward her desk, she could feel the eyes of her co-workers lingering on her. Some of them already knew what had happened in the cafeteria that day. Some had heard whispers about her meeting with Omar. She wasn't sure how many of them were waiting for her downfall. She slumped into her chair, exhaling sharply. This isn't over. She needed to be careful. She needed to fix this. Tina slid into the seat next to her, lowering her voice. Well? Karen shook her head, still feeling the weight of the conversation. He knows everything. Tina sighed. Yeah, no kidding. I thought he was going to fire me, Karen admitted, her voice uncharacteristically small. Tina shrugged. Honestly, I wouldn't have been surprised if he had. You really put your foot in it, Karen? Karen gave her an annoyed glance. Thanks for the support. Tina leaned back in her chair. I'm just saying you're lucky. Most bosses wouldn't even give you a chance. They'd just cut you loose. Karen chewed on her lip. As much as she hated to admit it, Tina was right. She had gotten a second chance, but she had no idea how to use it. The shift in the office. Karen spent the next few weeks walking on eggshells. She tried to stay out of Omar's way, avoiding any direct interaction unless absolutely necessary. Every time she passed by his office, she felt her stomach tighten, wondering if today would be the day she finally got called in for her termination. But Omar never confronted her again. Instead, he focused on restructuring the company culture. His changes weren't just for show, they transformed the office. Promotions were now based on merit. Employees who had been overlooked for years started getting the recognition they deserved. Diversity initiatives were put in place, ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, had equal opportunities to grow. For the first time, the workplace felt different. And Karen? She realized she was falling behind. She had always coasted on favoritism and office politics, but under Omar's leadership, that didn't work anymore. Now her attitude was a liability, and people had noticed. Karen's realization. One afternoon, Karen was reviewing financial reports when she overheard a conversation in the break room. I love what Omar's doing, one coworker said. It finally feels like we're being valued. Another nodded. Yeah, it's crazy how much things have changed. Before, you had to be part of the in crowd to get anywhere. Now, it's all about actual talent. Karen's stomach twisted. She had been part of that in crowd. and now it was disappearing. Tina walked in, grabbing a cup of coffee. She noticed Karen's expression and smirked. Reality hitting you yet? Karen shot her a glare. What's that supposed to mean? Tina shrugged. You're realizing that the way things worked before is over. You're not untouchable anymore, Karen. If you don't change, you're going to be left behind. Karen wanted to argue. She wanted to say that Tina was overreacting. But deep down she knew the truth. She had to change. The attempt at redemption. The next day, Karen made her first real effort to be different. She held the elevator for a coworker she usually ignored. She gave credit to a junior associate in a meeting instead of taking the praise for herself. She even forced herself to acknowledge Omar in the hallway, offering a polite nod instead of avoiding eye contact. It felt unnatural, and people noticed. Some were skeptical. They had seen who Karen was before. Others simply ignored her. She had already burned too many bridges. But there was one person whose reaction mattered more than anyone else's. Omar. He hadn't spoken to her directly since their meeting. But one afternoon, as Karen was finishing up a report, she heard a voice behind her. Ms. Monroe. She turned quickly. Omar stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her with an unreadable expression. I've been noticing some changes in your approach lately, he said. Karen swallowed. I've been trying. Omar nodded, considering her words. Then after a moment he said, good. Keep trying. Then he walked away. Karen exhaled deeply, feeling something she hadn't expected. Relief. For the first time in a long time she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could fix this. The final lesson. Months passed and Karen continued making changes. She still had moments of struggle, moments of frustration, but she didn't go back to her old ways. She worked harder, treating her co-workers with actual respect. She even started mentoring new hires instead of dismissing them. And then one day she found herself back in the cafeteria. She was standing in line, waiting for her order, when a new employee stepped in behind her. He was young, dressed neatly, with a traditional Muslim cap and an eager expression. A year ago, Karen might have rolled her eyes. A year ago, she might have muttered something under her breath. But today? She turned, offering a small but genuine smile. First week? The young man looked surprised, then nodded. Yeah, it's been great so far. Karen hesitated, then said, welcome to the team. From across the cafeteria, Omar stood near the executive section, watching the exchange. He didn't say anything. But as Karen turned away, she caught the smallest hint of approval in his eyes. Maybe she wasn't perfect. Maybe she had made mistakes. But people could change. And she was proof of it. Final scene, a new beginning. Karen was called into Omar's office one last time. She sat across from him, hands folded, waiting for his verdict. Karen, Omar said, his voice steady, you've made real progress. But change isn't about a few good months, it's about consistency. She nodded. I know. Omar leaned back in his chair. I'm willing to give you more responsibility. But it's up to you to prove that this isn't temporary. Karen felt a strange sense of gratitude. He could have fired her. He could have ignored her. But instead, he gave her the chance to be better. And for the first time in her life, she intended to take it. As she stood and shook his hand, she knew that her past didn't define her. Only her actions going forward would. A year had passed since Karen's humiliating realization in the cafeteria. A year since she had been forced to confront the consequences of her arrogance. The changes she had made weren't easy, and they weren't immediate, but she had stayed consistent. She had to. Omar had made it clear. This company was moving forward, and if she couldn't keep up, she'd be left behind. She sat at her desk, flipping through a quarterly report, when an unexpected email landed in her inbox. Subject, Performance Review, Omar Hassan. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't a routine check-in. Her department's new promotion cycle was approaching. There was a chance that this meeting would determine her future at the company. Would Omar see her efforts? Would he believe she had truly changed? Or would she forever be labeled as the woman who mocked him in the cafeteria? Tina leaned over her desk. You look like you've seen a ghost? Karen sighed. Performance review with Omar. Tina's eyebrows shot up. Oh, that's big. Karen nodded, tapping her fingers against her desk. Do you think I have a chance? I mean, really? Tina tilted her head. A year ago? No. You would have been out the door in a heartbeat. But now? She shrugged. I think it depends. Karen frowned. On what? On whether Omar believes this is really who you are now. Tina gave her a pointed look. You've worked hard. People notice. But Omar? He's not someone you can fool. So, if this isn't real, if you're just doing this to save yourself, He'll see right through it? Karen swallowed. The truth was, she didn't know if she was doing this just to survive or if she had truly changed. Somewhere along the way, the effort became automatic. She had stopped faking respect and had started actually giving it. Had it been long enough to erase who she was before? There was only one way to find out. The meeting. Karen knocked on Omar's office door at precisely 2 p.m. "Come in," his voice called. She stepped inside, standing tall. Whatever happened next, she would face it head-on. Omar sat at his desk, glancing up at her. "Karen, take a seat." She did, folding her hands in her lap as he scanned through her file. The silence was deafening. After a moment, he set the folder down and met her gaze. "It's been quite a year, hasn't it?" Karen nodded. "Yes, sir." "You've made improvements," he said, nodding slightly. "I won't deny that." A flicker of relief sparked in Karen's chest. But Omar wasn't done. "The question is, are they real?" Karen felt her throat tighten. "What do you mean?" Omar leaned forward slightly. "When I took over this position, I inherited a company that was broken in more ways than one. It wasn't just the policies, it was the culture. People like you thrived in that environment." He studied her reaction carefully. "And yet, over the past year you've changed. Or at least you've tried to." Karen resisted the urge to look away. "I have." Omar held her gaze. "Then tell me why?" She hesitated. The easy answer was self-preservation. She could say that she did it because she wanted to keep her job, that she knew the old ways wouldn't work anymore. But something deep in her gut told her Omar wasn't asking for a rehearsed answer. So she told him the truth. "At first it was fear," she admitted. "Fear of losing my job, fear of becoming irrelevant in a company that was changing around me." She swallowed. "But over time I realized something. The company wasn't the problem. I was." Omar raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her honesty. "I used to think respect was just about power," Karen continued. "That as long as I was on top, I didn't need to care about how I treated people. But watching the changes you made, seeing the way people flourished under fair leadership, it made me realize how wrong I was. I wasn't strong before. I was just protected by a system that rewarded the worst parts of me." She inhaled sharply. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Silence filled the room. Then Omar smiled. For the first time since they had met, it wasn't polite or measured or forced. It was genuine. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "when I first met you, I thought you were beyond saving." Karen exhaled slowly. "I thought so too." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You've proved me wrong." He tapped a pen against his desk. "You're still a work in progress, Karen. But so is everyone else. The difference is you're finally aware of it." She held her breath as he flipped open her file, scribbled something inside, and then looked up. "You'll be getting a promotion," he said. Karen's heart nearly stopped. "What?" Omar's expression was firm but approving. "You've earned it. Not because of where you started, but because of where you're going." His eyes sharpened slightly. "Don't make me regret it." Karen nodded quickly, unable to stop the small smile that crept onto her face. "I won't." Omar extended his hand. "Congratulations, Ms. Monroe." She shook it, her grip strong. "Thank you, Mr. Hassan." As she walked out of his office, she didn't feel relief. She felt something she hadn't expected. Pride. Not in tricking the system. Not in climbing over people to get ahead. But in actually earning her place. For the first time in her life, she belonged. And this time, she wasn't going to waste it. A few weeks after her promotion, Karen found herself standing in front of a team of new hires, leading their first onboarding session. She never thought she'd be in this position. A mentor, a guide, someone others looked up to. As she walked through the agenda, she caught sight of a young woman sitting near the back. She was quiet, listening intently, but there was something familiar in her eyes. Uncertainty. Karen knew that look. She had worn it herself not too long ago. After the session ended, Karen approached her. "Hey," she said, offering a small smile. "How's your first week going?" The woman hesitated before answering. "It's been different." Karen nodded. "I get that." The woman sighed, glancing around the office. "Honestly, I was nervous coming in. I've heard stories about how corporate environments can be difficult for people like me." Karen didn't have to ask what she meant. She already knew. She thought back to how she had treated people like this woman before she had changed. She thought about how she had once been part of the problem. Now she had the chance to do something about it. "Well," Karen said, her voice steady, "I won't lie to you. It's not always easy. But I can tell you one thing, this place is different now. And if you ever need anything, you can come to me." The woman's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" Karen smiled. Really? For the first time, the woman relaxed. Thank you, she said softly. That means a lot. Karen nodded, a sense of responsibility settling over her. She wasn't just proving something to herself anymore. She was proving it to everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. This was her second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. The full circle moment. Months passed and Karen continued growing into her role. She took on more leadership responsibilities, became a trusted voice in team meetings, and even started working directly with Omar on company-wide initiatives. She was no longer just another employee. She was part of something bigger. And then, one afternoon, something happened that truly solidified how much had changed. She was in line at the cafeteria, waiting for her lunch, when a familiar voice spoke behind her. Long line today? Karen turned and froze. It was Omar. For a split second, she felt a flicker of old anxiety. Memories of the first time they stood in this very spot came rushing back. The humiliation, the shame, the moment she had ruined her own reputation in a matter of seconds. But this time was different. She wasn't that person anymore. Karen smiled. Yeah, guess everyone's hungry today. Omar nodded, then gave her a knowing look. Feels familiar, doesn't it? Karen let out a small laugh. It does? Pause. Then Omar said, You've come a long way, Karen. She swallowed, suddenly feeling the weight of the moment. I had a good example to follow. Omar smirked. Glad to hear that. And just like that, the past was no longer a weight on her shoulders. It was just part of the story that got her here. As they reached the front of the line, Karen noticed a new employee standing behind them, a nervous young man clutching his tray like it was a shield. Karen turned to him just like someone once had for her. Hey, she said, first week? The man blinked, surprised. Yeah. Is it that obvious? Karen smiled. A little. Don't worry, you'll find your rhythm. She stepped aside, letting him go ahead of her in line. Omar watched, saying nothing, but his approving nod said everything. Karen had learned her lesson. And now she was passing it on. A year had passed since Karen's life had completely changed. She had gone from being the entitled, dismissive employee who laughed at the wrong person, to someone who earned her place through hard work and self-awareness. But what surprised her most was how much she actually enjoyed it. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just trying to climb the ladder for the sake of power, she was making a difference. One afternoon, she sat at her desk, flipping through reports, when an email notification popped up. Subject: Upcoming Leadership Summit, panel speakers announced. Curious, she opened it. The company was hosting a leadership event, bringing in executives, industry leaders, and employees to discuss workplace culture, diversity, and innovation. She scrolled through the list of guest speakers, and then her breath caught in her throat. Her name was on it. Karen Monroe, Director of Financial Operations, Henderson & Company. For a second, she couldn't believe it. She had gone from almost being fired to being asked to speak as a leader. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. She needed to tell someone. Instead, before she could even send a message, her office door swung open. Omar stood in the doorway, arms crossed, an amused expression on his face. I assume you've seen the email? Karen laughed, shaking her head. I'm still processing it. Omar stepped inside, his presence still commanding, but there was something different now. The power dynamic between them had shifted over time. He was no longer the intimidating boss she once feared. He was a mentor, a guiding force in her professional growth. You earned it, he said simply. Karen exhaled. A year ago, I never would have imagined this. Omar nodded. A year ago, neither would I. She laughed at that, but there was no bitterness in his tone, just honesty. Omar leaned against her desk. You're going to be great up there. Karen raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Omar smirked. Well, you've certainly had a lot of personal experience with company culture. Might as well put it to good use. She rolled her eyes. Yeah. Let's never bring up the cafeteria incident again. Omar chuckled. Deal? But then he grew serious. I mean it, Karen. Your journey is exactly the kind of story people need to hear. It's not just about second chances. It's about what you do with them. Karen nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She wasn't just speaking on a panel. She was proving that people could change. And this time she wasn't afraid to be seen. The Leadership Summit. The day of the event, Karen stood backstage, heart pounding as she listened to the MC announce her name. She took a deep breath, smoothing her blazer. This was it. She stepped onto the stage, blinking against the bright lights as she faced a packed audience. Executives, employees, and even some of the same co-workers who had once laughed along with her at the expense of others. She cleared her throat and began. "A little over a year ago," she said, voice steady, "I was almost fired." A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. I wasn't fired because of my work performance. I wasn't fired because I was late or bad at my job. I was nearly fired because I was contributing to the kind of workplace culture that holds people back. She paused, letting the words sink in. I was the kind of person who laughed at things I didn't understand, who dismissed people who didn't look like me, who came from different backgrounds, who I assumed didn't belong. She exhaled. But I was wrong. And someone gave me the chance to see that. Karen glanced at Omar, who sat in the front row, watching her with a calm, unreadable expression. I took that chance. And I'm standing here today because I chose to learn, to grow, and to do better. I'm standing here today because someone believed that change is possible. She saw heads nodding in the audience. Some people looked thoughtful. Others looked uncomfortable because they recognized themselves in her past. Good. That's what leadership is, Karen continued. It's not just about who sits at the top. It's about how we treat the people around us, how we choose to show up every day. She let a small smile appear. So if you ever find yourself in the position to give someone a second chance, take it. Because you never know how much that chance might change someone's life. The room fell completely silent for a beat. Then the applause erupted. Karen let out a slow breath, soaking it in. She had come full circle. And this time she belonged. The final conversation. After the event, Karen stood near the exit, shaking hands with attendees who approached her. Some thanked her for her honesty. Others told her they saw themselves in her story. And then, as the crowd began to thin, Omar walked up to her. No standing ovation, he teased. Karen rolled her eyes, laughing. I'll take what I can get. He smiled. You did good, Karen. Something about those words hit deeper than she expected. A year ago, Omar had every reason to fire her. Instead, he had given her a chance. And she had made sure to never waste it. Karen exhaled, shaking her head. I have to admit, I wouldn't be here without you. Omar shrugged. Maybe. But you did the work. Karen smiled. Guess I did. Omar extended his hand. Congratulations, Director Monroe. Karen shook it, this time with confidence. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. And as she walked out of the event, she knew this was only the beginning. A few weeks after the leadership summit, Karen sat in her office, reflecting on how much had changed. She had gone from being the problem to becoming part of the solution. It still felt surreal sometimes, how she had almost thrown her career away with arrogance and entitlement, how she had misjudged someone so completely, and how, instead of being shut out, she had been given an opportunity to grow. But growth didn't happen overnight. And Karen knew that her journey wasn't just about what she had learned, it was about what she would do next. She was deep in thought when her phone buzzed. A new email from Omar. Subject, let's talk. Her stomach tightened for a brief second, old habits of anxiety creeping in. But she quickly pushed it down. She wasn't the same person she was a year ago. She had earned her place. She stood, straightened her blazer, and made her way to his office. A new challenge. Omar looked up as Karen stepped inside, gesturing for her to take a seat. You're doing well, he said, skipping any pleasantries. The team respects you. The leadership summit proved that. Karen nodded. I appreciate that. Omar studied her for a moment. But I didn't call you here just to tell you that. Karen braced herself. What's going on? He slid a file across his desk. An opportunity. Karen picked it up, flipping through the contents. It was an expansion proposal. Plans to open a new regional office in a growing market. Omar leaned forward. I want you to lead it. Karen's eyes widened. Me? He nodded. You've proven you can handle responsibility. You've rebuilt your reputation here. This is the next step. Karen's mind raced. It was a huge opportunity, a leadership role that would put her in charge of an entire team. A chance to step out from Omar's direct shadow and prove she could do this on her own. But with that realization came fear. What if I'm not ready? She asked honestly. Omar tilted his head. Are you asking me or yourself? Karen let out a slow breath. I don't know. Omar chuckled. That's the first time I've ever heard you doubt yourself. A year ago, you would have jumped in headfirst, convinced you were the smartest person in the room. Karen winced but nodded. I've learned a lot since then. He folded his hands. Then take this as your final lesson. Leaders don't wait until they feel ready. They take the risk, they step up, and they grow into the role. Karen absorbed that, letting the words settle. She wanted this. She had earned this. And she wasn't going to let fear hold her back. She met Omar's gaze and nodded. Okay, I'll do it. Omar smiled. Good. You leave in 2 weeks. Karen blinked. Wait, what? Omar laughed. Time moves fast, director. Better get packing. The farewell. 2 weeks later, Karen stood in the middle of the office, surrounded by her colleagues. They had gathered for a small farewell celebration, not because she was leaving the company, but because she was moving up. Tina handed her a cup of coffee. So, you're officially the boss now, huh? Karen smirked. Looks like it. Tina shook her head. Who would have thought? From office gossip queen to company leader. Karen chuckled. Trust me, no one is more surprised than I am. Tina nudged her. You deserve it, Karen. Karen felt the words deeply. A year ago, she might have shrugged off the compliment, or assumed she had gotten lucky. But now she believed it. Across the room, she saw Omar standing near his office, watching the celebration with a small, knowing smile. Their eyes met and no words were needed. He had given her a second chance, and she had proven she was worth it. A new beginning. As Karen packed the last of her office belongings, she took a moment to look around. This place had once been her comfort zone, but she was ready to move forward. With one last deep breath, she picked up her things, squared her shoulders and walked out, not as the woman who had laughed at the wrong person, but as the woman who had become the right kind of leader. A month had passed since Karen took over her new leadership role at the regional office. It was a whirlwind of change, new team, new responsibilities, new expectations. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt something else. Purpose. She wasn't just managing a department anymore. She was shaping an entire work culture from the ground up. This was her test, and she was determined to pass it. The first challenge. Karen sat in her new office, reviewing reports when she overheard a tense conversation just outside her door. I don't see why we need to make a big deal about this, a male employee muttered. People need to stop being so sensitive. Karen frowned. She stepped outside and saw two employees, one looking uncomfortable, the other dismissive. What's going on? She asked. The younger employee, a woman named Maria, hesitated before speaking. I was just explaining why we need more accessibility accommodations in the office. Some of our colleagues have mobility issues, and I suggested small changes that would help. The other employee, Jason, scoffed. And I said the company already does enough. People just need to deal with it. Karen felt an eerie sense of déjà vu. She saw herself in Jason. A year ago, she might have reacted the same way, mocking what she didn't understand, dismissing the needs of others. But she wasn't that person anymore. She turned to Maria. That's a great suggestion. Let's look into what changes we can implement. Then she turned to Jason. Can I see you in my office? A conversation she once needed. Jason sat across from her, looking annoyed. Listen, he said before she could even speak, I wasn't trying to be rude. I just think we're overcomplicating things. Karen folded her hands on the desk. She knew this argument well. She had once used it herself. You remind me of myself, she said simply. Jason blinked. Excuse me? She leaned forward slightly. A year ago, I sat in an office like this because I had dismissed someone. Because I had assumed I knew better than people whose experiences were different from mine. Jason shifted uncomfortably. And let me tell you something, Karen continued, her voice firm but calm. That conversation changed my life. Not because someone yelled at me. Not because I got punished. But because I had to ask myself a question. What kind of person do I want to be? Jason swallowed hard. I didn't mean to sound like a jerk. Karen nodded. I believe you. But intent doesn't erase impact. We're leaders, Jason. And leadership isn't about deciding what matters to us. It's about listening to what matters to our people. Jason was silent for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Okay, I get it. Karen smiled. Good. Now let's make this office better for everyone. The legacy she was building. As the weeks passed, Karen transformed the office culture. She saw Jason making an effort, actively participating in discussions he would have once dismissed. She saw Maria stepping up, leading initiatives that made the workplace more inclusive. And most importantly, she saw herself, not as the person she used to be, but as the leader she had become. One afternoon, as she was wrapping up work, she received an email from Omar. Subject, proud of you. Karen smiled. She had made mistakes. She had learned. And now she was helping others do the same. This wasn't just a second chance anymore. This was her legacy.